The Bible is tricky, especially parables. They're supposed to make us think, but we often read them through the lenses of what others have said. And this is especially true of today's parable, because not only do we get the words, but we usually read the interpretation that's later in the chapter. The interpretation claims to be from Jesus, but what we're glimpsing really is a sermon of sorts, as the author of Matthew takes Jesus's words and then applies them to a situation in his community. So taking that cue, I'd like to consider something critical for us right now. I'd like to ponder the parable in terms of racism, especially through Ijoma Olawu's words. So you want to talk about race, a book which I've been reading as part of a study with some colleagues. And before I begin, I'd like to share an assumption that every person, the proverbial seed, has a right to good soil. That is, a right to thrive. That doesn't mean that there won't be life situations that can't be avoided. But I believe there is systemic barriers in Canada, in the US and other parts of the world that are preventing Black, Indigenous, and other racialized people from thriving. These are grounded in biases that are the opposite to Barbara Holmes' assertion that we're all citizens of a human and cosmic community. In fact, what she later calls our self-induced dreams of control, domination, victimization, and self-hatred. So, what are these barriers? I like to begin by looking at the seeds that fall on the path. The birds in the image remind me of the microaggressions that I spoke of a couple of weeks ago. Like being pecked at, they accumulate and erode self-esteem. They're not always verbal. Sometimes it's someone who crosses a street or clutches their purse or follows you in a store. In my first year in ministry, a couple shared with me something that had happened in a local shop. She was Cree, him, white. They came into the store separately, and the person working there didn't realize that the woman who came in after him was his spouse. As she came in, the clerk made a big sniffing noise. "Ugh, I smell Indian," they said. The husband went to the clerk and tore a strip off, but most often his wife had to face this circumstance on her own. Now, more troubling is what Black, Indigenous, and other people of color experience regularly with police, and not just in a possible arrest situation. Olawu wrote about how when she just got her driver's license at the age of 16, she was pulled over in a mostly white neighborhood. When she reached for the glove box for her registration insurance, as the officer had told her to do, he suddenly yelled, "Stop!" as he reached for his gun and lectured her as to why you never, ever do anything without telling the officer what you're about to do first. "That's a good way to get yourself shot, young lady," he said. I've never had to tell police what I'm about to do. I've never had to think about how I'm going to respond to the officer, where my hands are, or had to text quickly what's just happened, just in case. But Black people do. They're perceived as a greater threat, even a teenage girl. And in Canada, Black and Middle Eastern drivers are pulled over more often than white ones, ticketed more often, and in the US are more likely to be searched, even handcuffed, than white drivers. And that's just driving. Even children are seen as a threat. Oluwu shares about a 5-year-old who was suspended for assaulting a teacher. A staff member wanted this kindergartner charged by the police. A kindergartner. Why not just talk to him? See what's going on. And it's not a Canadian practice to document race in terms of student discipline, but a recent study in Ontario suggests we have a similar issue here as in the US, where Black children are more likely to be suspended, expelled, or referred to the police than white kids are. Are they more violent, more disruptive? No, but that is unconscious bias at work. They're also perceived as older. That's how a 12-year-old holding a toy gun is killed. Imagine the constant sense of fear for adults, parents, kids, taking a toll emotionally and physically. So along with these birds of fear, there are also weeds. Now, at first, the seedlings do well, but they start getting choked out. We speak of a glass ceiling, but you need to be in the building for there to even be a ceiling. Not only do Black, Indigenous, and Latinx kids receive harsher discipline, but despite being as bright as white kids, they're viewed as less likely to succeed, are less often tested for gifted classes, more often tracked towards vocational training. And classmates have biases as well. Oluwu writes how, as she aspired to go to university, she was put down by the other nerdy kids. That's the way she describes them. And as much as she grew, well, the weeds grew as well. She got her degree, but struggled to find a job. She wasn't taken seriously for promotions, and even when she was offered one, when they realized she was Black, the offer was rescinded. Now, the last couple of months, I've been having some frank conversations with people of color in the congregation, and her experience happens here in Canada. Race factors into pay disparity as well. Did you know in the US, the biggest gap is between Latino men and white men? 69 cents to the dollar. Now that speaks to me about plants that wither because they don't have anything to root into. The image reminded me of a discussion we had recently at HARE about Black Nova Scotians. In addition to freed slaves, there were also Black loyalists who came to Nova Scotia. They'd fought alongside the British during the Revolution, and more came in the War of 1812. In both cases, promises of land weren't kept. In fact, many didn't even have title to property. In Africville, which is close to Halifax, well, that's where the city dump ended up being placed. And rather than bring services to the area, in the 1960s, the city wanted to relocate the residents. Well, no deeds meant you didn't get full value for your home when you were relocated. We ask how there can be intergenerational poverty. I ask instead, why wouldn't there be when these soldiers and then their sons couldn't get work generation after generation? Add to that the pay gap, higher rates of incarceration due to racial bias, difficulty in getting a bank loan to either open a business or to go to school. The system starts to feel really, really fixed. And that's what Kimberly Jones names in a YouTube video. I hope you've seen it. She calls out how slavery made it possible for white families to gain wealth and to pass it down from generation to generation. She compares it to a Monopoly game, where for the first 400 rounds you play for your opponent, And then when you get to play for yourself, every time you get ahead, your opponent slaps you down again. It's powerful testimony and cuts through all of the "I succeeded, why can't you" malarkey that are often leveled against communities of color. As I shared last week, part of our spiritual journey is to let go of ourselves so that love can grow and we can nurture supportive community. In other words, so we can cultivate good soil. For those of us who are white, that means facing some hard truths about the way the world really is for most people. Jesus challenges the injustices in the world and stands with us as we do the same in ours. Barbara Holmes reminds us that we can't be hamsters on a wheel, effectively propping up an unjust system, but rather as seekers of light and life, we need to work together for a world where the foundations of hierarchy, dominance, and rationality are crumbling, and where proponents of equity have found their public voice. That's what we see in the protests. It's what we hear in calls to defund the police. It's what we witness in people rallying to ensure there are means for everyone, I mean everyone, to thrive. I believe Spirit is at work in this, reminding us that if we are made in God's image, which we profess to believe, then seeds shouldn't be pecked at. There should be enough soil for the seedling. The seedling shouldn't be choked out by weeds. Instead, there needs to be good soil for us all. So let's cultivate that.